Josh Hamilton. Josh Hamilton's career was one of those rare baseball stories that felt bigger than the game itself. Drafted first overall by the Tampa Bay Devil Rays back in 1999, people thought he was destined to be a Hall of Famer. He had all the tools, including speed, power, and a swing that looked like it belonged in a highlight reel every night. But Hamilton's career took a long and painful detour before he even became a star. His struggles with addiction kept him out of the majors for years, and it wasn't until 2007, almost a decade after being drafted, that he finally broke through with the Cincinnati Reds. The following year, he landed with the Texas Rangers, where everything changed. From 2008 through 2012, he was one of the most feared hitters in baseball. Fans remember his jaw-dropping performance at the 2008 Home Run Derby, where he smashed 28 homers in a single round, and his 2010 MVP season, which carried the Rangers all the way to the World Series. He also became a 5-time All-Star, won Silver Slugger awards, and even led the league in RBIs and batting average at his peak. But while Hamilton's story was inspiring on the field, his off-the-field life kept unraveling. Addiction never fully let go of him, and in 2015, he admitted to another relapse involving cocaine and alcohol. What made it different was that he voluntarily reported it to Major League Baseball, something that probably saved him from suspension, but also showed how deeply he was still struggling. That same year, his marriage fell apart after 11 years. Things only got darker after his retirement, as he did something that was downright crazy. In 2019, Hamilton was arrested for assaulting his oldest daughter, an event that shocked even longtime fans who had supported him through his addiction struggles. In 2022, he pleaded guilty to a lesser charge, receiving probation and community service in the process. So, the man once seen as baseball's greatest redemption story ended up with a reputation clouded by legal trouble and personal demons, leaving fans to wonder what could have been if his battles hadn't followed him so relentlessly.
Esteban Loaiza. Esteban Loaiza wasn't a household name like some of the biggest pitchers of his era, but he carved out a very solid career that spanned more than a decade. Born in Tijuana, Mexico, Loaiza worked his way up to the big leagues, making his debut in 1995 with the Pittsburgh Pirates. He went on to pitch for several teams, including the Rangers, White Sox, Blue Jays, Yankees, and Dodgers. However, his best season came in 2003 with the Chicago White Sox, when he shocked the baseball world by finishing second in the American League Cy Young voting. He won 21 games that year, struck out more than 200 batters, and even started the All-Star game at U.S. Cellular Field in Chicago. For a pitcher who was often seen as middle of the rotation, that season was the peak of his career, and by the time he retired in 2007, he had racked up 126 wins, more than 2,000 innings pitched, and the respect of fans in both the U.S. and Mexico. But after retirement, Loaiza's name started popping up for all the wrong reasons. In February 2018, more than a decade after his last pitch, he was arrested in San Diego with over 20 kilograms of cocaine. The sheer amount stunned people, as it wasn't a small-time bust, but a major trafficking case. The charges included possession with intent to distribute and transporting narcotics, crimes that carried heavy prison time. What made the situation even more shocking was that Loaiza had been married to the late singer Jenny Rivera, a major celebrity in Latin America, which put even more attention on the case. He eventually pleaded guilty, and in March 2019 was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. After serving time, he was released in 2021 and deported back to Mexico. For a player who once stood proudly on the mound at an All-Star game, his post-baseball life became a reminder of how quickly things can spiral when money, fame, and crazy choices mix. Willie Aikens. Willie Aikens was once one of the most promising hitters in the late 1970s and early 1980s. A first baseman with a powerful bat, he made his mark with the Kansas City Royals after being traded from the California Angels. Aikens will always be remembered for his performance in the 1980 World Series, where he hit 4 home runs in 6 games against the Philadelphia Phillies. At the time, he looked like a cornerstone player who could carry a lineup for years. While his career numbers were solid, including several seasons of 20 or more homers, he never quite reached superstar status. And by 1985, at just 30 years old, Aikens was out of Major League Baseball. Now, his struggles weren't about injuries or age, they were about drugs. Yes, Aikens became heavily involved with cocaine and later crack cocaine. After baseball, instead of living a quiet life or staying in the sport as a coach, he dove deeper into drug use and eventually into selling.
In 1994, he was arrested for distributing large amounts of crack cocaine and sentenced to 20 years in prison, a punishment that reflected the harsh drug laws of the era. His story became infamous because he wasn't just a user, he was caught dealing in quantities that made it impossible for the court to be lenient. Akins ended up serving 14 years before changes in federal sentencing guidelines gave him an early release in 2008. By then, his story was often brought up in discussions about athletes who fell from grace and the impact of strict drug laws on nonviolent offenders. Since his release, Akins has tried to rebuild his life, even working in baseball again in coaching and mentoring roles. But his name will forever carry the shadow of a career and life derailed by addiction and prison, a sharp contrast to that shining moment in 1980 when he looked like he might be a legend. Sammy Stewart. Sammy Stewart's career in the big leagues had the kind of start most pitchers dream about. He broke into the majors with the Baltimore Orioles in 1978, and in his very first outing, he struck out 7 batters in 3 innings. That debut set the tone for what looked like a promising career. Stewart spent nearly a decade in the majors, mostly as a reliable reliever and spot starter. He wasn't the kind of player who dominated headlines every week, but Orioles fans remember him as a guy who always showed up ready to compete. His best years came in the early 1980s, and he even played a role in helping Baltimore win the 1983 World Series. By the time he retired in 1987, Stewart had appeared in over 300 games, leaving behind a reputation as a hard-working pitcher who carved out a solid career. But once baseball was behind him, Stewart's life turned upside down very fast. Without the game's structure and spotlight, he turned to crack cocaine, and the addiction took hold of him in ways he couldn't escape. He was homeless many times, up to the point he started sleeping under bridges. He also spent long stretches living rough and started building up arrests that made headlines for all the wrong reasons. In fact, by the early 2000s, Stewart had become more known for his mugshots than his baseball stats. In 2006, things reached their breaking point when he was handed a long prison sentence for drug-related charges. He spent 7 years behind bars, not seeing freedom again until 2013. By then, the man who once stood on a championship mound was a symbol of how far someone could fall. Fans who remembered his Orioles days were left with a painful reminder that even World Series heroes aren't protected from life's darker turns. Stewart's post-baseball years became a tragic example of how addiction can wipe away not only a career, but almost everything else too. Brian Holton. Brian Holton's career didn't last as long as some of the names from his era, but he still made his mark in the late 1980s. He came up as a pitcher for the Los Angeles Dodgers and spent several seasons bouncing between the bullpen and starting rotation. His biggest moment came in 1988, when he was part of that legendary Dodgers team that shocked the world by winning the World Series against the heavily favored Oakland A's. Even though Holton wasn't one of the stars, he was a key piece of the roster, and like the rest of the team, he walked away with a championship ring that year. Then, after a trade to Baltimore, he pitched a couple more seasons before stepping away from the game in 1990. But when his playing days ended, Holton's life spun out of control. Without the routine of baseball, he turned heavily to alcohol and painkillers, a combination that pulled him deeper into a cycle he couldn't break. His finances crumbled so badly that he did something unimaginable. He was so desperate for money that he pawned his cherished World Series ring. I mean, that ring was a symbol of the greatest moment of his entire career. And he sold it for change. That moment showed just how far Holton had fallen. But his troubles didn't stop there. He was arrested and jailed for failing to keep up with court-ordered child support payments, and at different times, he ended up living in shelters. For fans, Holton's story became a tough one to watch, because it was about more than just bad luck. It was about a slow and steady collapse after the cheers had stopped. The man who once celebrated on the biggest stage in baseball found himself forgotten and stripped of the memories he worked so hard to earn. His journey shows how the end of a sports career, especially for players without superstar money, can be the start of battles they never saw coming. Chad Curtis. Chad Curtis played in the majors between 1992 and 2001, and during that time, he built a reputation as a scrappy outfielder with solid defense and a knack for clutch moments. He suited up for 6 different teams, including the Detroit Tigers, New York Yankees, and Texas Rangers. Curtis wasn't a superstar, but he had memorable highlights, especially during his time in New York. In the 1999 World Series, he hit a walk-off home run in Game 3 against the Atlanta Braves, a moment that cemented his place in Yankee history. And by the time he retired in 2001, Curtis had logged more than 1,000 games, several playoff appearances, and a World Series title. But his reputation took a devastating turn after baseball. Curtis, who had moved into teaching and coaching after retirement, was trusted by families and schools to mentor kids. Instead, he betrayed that trust in one of the worst ways possible. In 2013, Curtis was convicted of sexually abusing multiple teenage female students while working as a high school volunteer strength trainer. The case shocked not just the baseball community but the general public, because it revealed how he had manipulated his position of authority. The conviction landed him a prison sentence of 7 to 15 years, of which he served 7 before being released. By the time he walked out, his name was permanently tied not to his clutch home runs or World Series heroics, but to crimes that left scars on young lives. Curtis went from celebrated athlete to disgraced felon, showing how quickly a legacy can be erased. For many fans, his downfall isn't even a what went wrong story. It's a story of betrayal that left no room for sympathy. His case stands out as one of the darkest post-baseball chapters of any former player.
Lenny Dykstra. Lenny Dykstra's career had all the highs you'd expect from a star in the 1980s and early 1990s. Known as Nails for his gritty style, Dykstra was one of those players who seemed to thrive in the biggest moments. He came up with the New York Mets in 1985 and was a spark plug for the team's legendary 1986 World Series championship. His speed, defense, and fearless approach at the plate made him a fan favorite. But it didn't stop there, because after a trade to the Philadelphia Phillies, he hit his peak in 1993 when he powered the team all the way to the World Series, putting up MVP-level numbers that year. For a while, Dykstra looked like the kind of player whose toughness would carry him far beyond baseball. But after retiring in 1996, injuries were no longer the only thing wearing him down. He made a fortune during his playing days, but stupidly lost tens of millions of dollars on reckless business deals, failed investments, and questionable ventures. Bankruptcy followed, and things only spiraled further. He was arrested multiple times for fraud, grand theft, and misuse of funds, including schemes where he scammed people out of money and even stole from his own business partners. Along the way, he fell deep into drugs and heavy drinking, which only made his public meltdowns worse. He also displayed other insane behavior, such as making terroristic threats and indecent exposure of his body. At one point, Dykstra went from being remembered for clutch home runs and stolen bases to being plastered on news headlines for jail time. His downfall became one of the most shocking post-retirement collapses in baseball history. Fans who once admired his fearless energy on the field now look at him as a cautionary tale of how money, fame, and addiction can destroy even the toughest reputations. Byron McLaughlin. Byron McLaughlin wasn't a household name, but he still had his shot in the majors during the late 1970s and early 1980s. A pitcher who bounced between the Seattle Mariners and California Angels, McLaughlin never became a star but held down a role for a few seasons. He showed flashes of ability and had stretches where he looked like he could settle into the league long-term. But by 1983, his career on the mound was done, and unlike some players who stayed around the game, McLaughlin decided to turn to a life of crime. After baseball, McLaughlin got involved in an international counterfeit shoe operation. Yes, he was running illegal factories in Mexico, creating fake versions of popular sneakers and selling them on the black market. And this wasn't a small-scale gig either, as his operation pulled in millions of dollars. McLaughlin laundered the money through banks around the world. But by 1990, U.S. authorities finally caught up with him, and he was arrested. But here's where the story takes an even wilder twist. Before his sentencing, McLaughlin fled. He got away before the courts could hand down punishment. To this day, he remains a fugitive, with his exact whereabouts unknown. His case became one of those bizarre post-sports stories where a former major leaguer ended up on the run, not from batters or managers, but from the law. For fans, it's a strange legacy. McLaughlin is less remembered for his years on the mound and more as the pitcher-turned-counterfeiter who disappeared rather than face prison. His story serves as one of baseball's weirdest reminders that sometimes life after the game can take a path no one would ever expect.
Orlando Cepeda. Orlando Cepeda is one of the biggest names ever to come out of Puerto Rico, and a player whose talent carried him into the Baseball Hall of Fame. Known as the Baby Bull, Cepeda broke into the majors in 1958 with the San Francisco Giants and immediately made an impact. He was named Rookie of the Year, and over the next decade he became one of the most feared hitters in the game. With his power at the plate and smooth glove at first base, Cepeda put together a career that included an MVP award in 1967, 11 All-Star appearances, and more than 2,300 hits. By the time he wrapped up his playing career in the mid-1970s, he was already seen as one of the greats of his generation. But in 1975, just a couple of years after his retirement, Cepeda's name hit the headlines for all the wrong reasons. He was arrested for trying to smuggle a massive load of marijuana into Puerto Rico. Authorities caught him with hundreds of pounds in his possession, and the case shocked fans who still saw him as a beloved figure. The arrest led to a conviction and a 5-year prison sentence. However, Cepeda only served about 10 months before being released on parole. The arrest cast a long shadow over his legacy. For years, Hall of Fame voters held the incident against him, delaying his induction despite his on-field numbers. It wasn't until 1999, through the Veterans Committee, that he finally earned his spot in Cooperstown. Cepeda's story is a reminder that even legendary careers can be tarnished by the darndest, most senseless off-the-field choices. Dwight Gooden. Dwight Gooden's journey to baseball stardom started like something out of a movie. Bursting onto the scene with the New York Mets in 1984, the teenager from Tampa became an instant sensation. At just 19 years old, he lit up Shea Stadium with strikeouts that left batters shaking their heads. That rookie season, he collected the National League Rookie of the Year award and a ticket to the All-Star game, making it clear the Mets had a new ace. The following year, he was even better. In 1985, Gooden put together one of the greatest pitching seasons the game has ever seen. He racked up 24 wins, a microscopic 1.53 ERA, 268 strikeouts, and 16 complete games. He not only won the Cy Young Award but also pulled off the rare pitching Triple Crown. The success kept rolling into 1986 when he helped the Mets capture the World Series, cementing his place in team history. Over the next few years, Gooden remained a top pitcher, but cracks slowly began to show. And by the early 1990s, his performance dipped as injuries and off-field issues piled up. In 1995, his career was derailed when drug suspensions cost him the entire season. Still, Gooden managed flashes of brilliance afterward, most notably his no-hitter with the Yankees in 1996, which was a reminder of the electric talent that had once taken the league by storm. He pitched for several more teams before finally stepping away from the game in the early 2000s. However, his Hall of Fame-level potential was never fully realized. After retirement, the challenges grew darker. Addiction continued to follow him, leading to multiple arrests and public struggles that overshadowed his baseball legacy. In 2006, he spent 7 months in prison for violating probation, a low point in a story that had started with so much promise. But despite the setbacks, Mets fans never forgot the magic of Doc Gooden in his prime, which is why in 2010, he was inducted into the Mets Hall of Fame. And in 2024, the team retired his number 16, honoring not just his greatness on the mound, but also his complicated place in baseball.